If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
At times on this podcast, we speak to individuals who are members of certain religious groups. Sometimes those stories come from large church organisations or small groups that have splintered off from a more established sect. Sometimes it is the immediate family of the guest sharing their story on the podcast that has broken away to start something new. And that is the case with Gael in today's mini-series. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and within this conversation is a rich history spanning generations that is enveloped around Gael's story, as we will hear it today. For early access to full-length and ad-free episodes, you can find me at patreon.com/thecultvault. But for now, here is Gael. So hello, Gael, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today to share your story. We're going to be covering lots of new material as well as learning about your experiences growing up in a branch of the Assemblies of God. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hello, Casey. Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. I'm absolutely delighted that you've given me the opportunity today to talk about my story, which is an interesting and troubling one and highlights very much about the trauma, the complex trauma that one can develop when they grow up in a cult such as mine. So I just wanted to correct you. Our cult was not a branch of the Assemblies of God. We actually my uncle, who was the leader of the cult, he actually broke away from the Assemblies of God and formed his own exclusive group that was not connected with any other church or cult. We were completely separated from any other church in Australia. But I guess the roots came from the Assemblies of God.
And what was the official title that your uncle gave this new group that he had formed?
He called it the Church of God. And I remember him telling us the reason, why it was called the Church of God is that we were this select group of people that were righteous and holy and were more holy than other churches. And that was the title that he felt was very fitting because we were representatives of God himself.
Church of God is such a generic sounding name, isn't it? I feel like if I was to Google Church of God, I'd probably get a list of locations near me of churches I could visit, different types of churches. Was there ever a time where people would come up to you and you'd say, oh, I'm with the Church of God, and they would know what you were talking about or mistake your group for something else?
They would always mistake our group with some other denomination, of course. And I'd say, what's that? What does that mean? Who are you connected with? And that's where, I would always feel uncomfortable because it never really sat well with me, even as a child, that we were this select group that, were trying to convert others. And I always felt this deep sense of shame. So when people would ask me, that question, I'd try and shy away from it.
So you're speaking about the Church of God as though you remember it being born almost. So did this happen after you were born?
No, so I was actually born into the church, so I was born in 1957. The church started around circa 1950, just after World War II. It was a doomsday cult, and, there was myself and my older brother and my younger sister. We were all born into the cult, the three of us. My older sister and older brother were not born into the cult, but they were around 2 and 3 years of age. My mum and dad, my parents, were converted and recruited into the church around the 1950s. My dad went to war. He was called up to fight in Papua New Guinea at the age of 19. So he was ripe for the pickings.
When you mentioned the Church of God being a doomsday cult, is this something that was influenced by the Assemblies of God and Pentecostalism, or is this something that your uncle brought into the Church of God that was his own inspired decision, prophecy, whatever word you'd like to use?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So he gleaned a lot of his beliefs. He carried across to his own cult a lot of the AOG, Assemblies of God, beliefs, but he gathered a lot of his other, I suppose, beliefs from people such as William Branham, for example. He was an American evangelist, and his ministry was around healing, that sort of thing. And he was quite extreme too. And he talked a lot about demon possession, William Branham, and my uncle really followed his teachings. And that was also, we were also indoctrinated with William Branham's teachings back in the day. So the doomsday thing came, I think he always believed it, but it was around the early 70s when it really started to emerge. I recall very much so back in, I think it was 1974. I was 16 years old, and he said that he'd got a vision, he'd received a vision from God that Christ was going to return 40 years after Israel became a nation, which was just after World War II. And he said that, this was 1974 when he said that. So he was calculating that in around about the 1984 that Christ would return, and we needed to get ready. And so at that point, he said that we were to move away. We had to sell up all our houses, and there were 3 families in the cult at that time. It was a very small, selective cult, and we had to sell our homes, leave our jobs, and pack up and move to Perth, where we were going to preach to people and try and win them over before Christ returned.
Your uncle was influenced by William Branham, who I understand was actually himself quite pivotal to the revival that happened after the Second World War. So they are actually proselytizing at the same time as each other, but on slightly different scales and audience sizes.
Yes. Now, I just wanted to just wind back a little bit. My uncle was converted just after World War II. There were a lot of, preachers, American evangelists coming out to Australia and in Britain as well. Even our wonderful Queen Elizabeth had a private meeting with Billy Graham. he was holding his crusades and traveling the world. You know, you must be born again. That was the message that he preached. So Billy Graham came to Australia. So did another evangelist by the name of Oral Roberts. Oral Roberts was really big in the 1950s, late 1940s. And he came out to Australia, I think, a number of times, holding what they could call tent crusades. And one of them was held in Melbourne, where my uncle attended one of those, and really inspired by Oral Roberts and became converted, which is what he said was a born-again experience. So that really kick-started him off. Then he, you know, as did a lot of those new converts of the day just after World War II, you know, there was a lot of social change happening. You know, people were looking for purpose in their life. And so was my uncle. My dad, who'd fought in World War II, came back after 3 years fighting up in New Guinea. And my uncle was looking for purpose as well, including my father. And so, as a lot of people did, they filtered into the local churches once those crusades, you know, those crusaders went back to America. And so that's what happened to my uncle. He went into the local, I don't think it was called the Assemblies of God, which hadn't really formed then in the 1950s, but I think they formed sort of mid-50s or they're around the same time. But anyway, he went into the Assemblies of God church in Ballarat, which is a mining town in Victoria.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
And he became very influential in the church. He showed a lot of leadership. He had all the qualities there to lead the church. But he started to split hairs over certain doctrines, and this is what happens. So he was highly charismatic. He was a powerful preacher. And it was over the doctrine of British Israel, where people believe that the Queen, if you trace her line right back, goes right back to King David in the Bible. It's a very interesting train of thought, but, you know, I don't believe it.
It's so interesting to hear about your uncle's history as you understand it. How did you come to learn about this?
I listened a lot as a child. We were very heavily involved, even as toddlers, even as primary school children we were all involved. And whilst the cult didn't attract a lot of people because the lifestyle was very harsh and not many people could live that way, we were all involved as children because my uncle saw us as the next generation to carry the cult forward, particularly for my brother. I think he was really groomed as he entered his late teens to be the next person to take it on. But so we heard a lot of these stories as children, and I think that's... I heard a lot of his story about how God told him to leave the Assemblies of God, set up his own church, and he said God told him that you have to walk this walk of faith. He was told to leave his job and set up this church, and God would provide. And that was quite a thing because as a child, I'd hear these amazing stories, and miraculously, at the last minute, food would be put on the table. But realistically, my dad, who was a lovely man, was carrying him financially, working sometimes 2 and 3 jobs to pay his bills and help them out financially.
Oh, this is already very tricky, isn't it, in terms of the coercion of followers outside of the family. But then when you really take a step back and realize that the coercion started with his own brother and his brother's family, wow, that is really, really something tricky to navigate, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it also comes down to the personality types too. My uncle was a very strong personality. He was a thinker. So when he was young, back in country Victoria, it was a gold mining town, and we can trace the family line right back to the convict years of gold miners. My dad was a gold miner. His father was a gold miner. His great-grandfather was a gold miner, right back to John, who was his ancestor, who came out on one of the convict ships from the UK. So, we were, a strong, I suppose, family line of battlers in many ways. And my uncle was a very, very strong personality, very powerful and very convincing. But my lovely father, he was a beautiful man, had the most softest of hearts, so you can imagine. He would give the shirt off his back to anyone who required it, who needed it more than him. Even during the cult years, my dad was bringing in homeless men who were on the streets in the freezing cold, didn't have a bed. Dad would bring them home, would give them a hot meal, and he would try and not convert them so much, but to rehabilitate them away from the alcohol, which was making them homeless. He always had a stash of money for us kids. If we were running out of cash when we're in our teenage years, early 20s, I'd say, Dad, I've got no money. And he'd say, go and have a look in my pocket. I've saved some money up for you. Go and get it. That's the kind of man he was. He helped everyone. People loved him. And that was the kind of personality my dad was. So his brother, powerful personality and very controlling. Dad was really quite easily manipulated into becoming part of the cult. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
I feel as though there's a pattern. And of course there is. This isn't something that, this isn't something that hasn't been explored. And this is obvious to most people listening, I imagine, at this point, that those qualities in a person are targeted.
Yes.
Whether a person is known to the recruiters or not. I think it's easy to tell if a person holds those qualities. And I do feel as though if you are identified as holding warmth, loyalty, perhaps a sense of being easily manipulated because of those things, I wouldn't say it puts a target on your back, because that's almost like victim blaming. But I think that perhaps people may see you as a potential target if you hold those qualities.
Yeah, Dad was a target. In fact, he was a very humble man. He didn't ask for much. And sometimes the wrong kind of people were attracted to Dad. He showed a lot of empathy, and his position as a Christian, and he genuinely believed he'd had what we call a born-again experience, my dad. And he believed that through and through, and he was genuine in his faith. He was very kind, loving, he was deeply attached to his mum as a young man. And, in various jobs in country Victoria, in the town of Ballarat, I just want to tell you the level of kindness Dad had to other human beings was one. He would take in the homeless, and he did that on his own accord. It wasn't anything to do with the church. but he would have a milk run and a bread run where he would deliver milk and bread to the local people of the town. And he would always call into the local shops and they would give him these huge bags of lollies. And Dad would deliver them to all the kids within the community. And everyone adored him. He always had a story to tell. He loved to sing and he would play his guitar. He was just the most amazing man. And I'm almost in tears thinking about my father because he was such a kind and gentle human being. And at the end of his life, it didn't turn out so well. And that's something I would really like to share with you about how people could manipulate my father in such a way that it broke his heart and it broke our family, tore our family apart.
Was your father the older brother or the younger brother?
Dad came from a family, I think the same, large families in country Victoria back in the day. Dad was from, I think, a family of 10. He had, big families. And he and his 2 older brothers and my uncle, who was the leader of the cult, were all called up to go to war. And he was one of the younger ones. So he wasn't the youngest. He was about, I think, the 2nd or 3rd youngest. And he was very close to his mother. He was the golden-haired boy and she loved him dearly. And consistent with his personality, even when he was fighting up in New Guinea, he didn't spend a cent on himself. He used to send all his income back to his mother because, they were struggling financially and all the pay would go back to her to put bread and butter on the table. That's the way he was.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
When you mentioned, this is just something I wanted to ask for my own curiosity. When you mentioned John, old ancestor John coming over on the convict ship, is there any sort of indication of what John was put on that ship for?
Yes. Now, he was a model prisoner. He stole something like a tool. I don't know what it was. He was born illegitimately. He was raised by the church. He did really nothing wrong, but he grew up in poverty, as you could imagine, back in, I think the early 1800s and by the church. And so once he was a young man trying to get on with his life, stole something just because he was trying to make a living. And he got caught and was sent to Australia. And his wife, Sarah Cook, she was an amazing woman. And this is where this charitable sort of approach comes in, because Dad was like her and like his ancestor. She was seen as giving out bread amongst the poor outside Hobart Jail. And John had been released and was a free man. And he said, you can't do that. If you do that, you're going to go to jail. Let's go to Ballarat. The gold rush was on, and that's where they went with their 2 children. And the rest is history. But that stems from way back then to me, where I am now as a social worker, helping out people and counselling people and changing their lives, hoping to change their lives. I
love that story. That is awesome. Gosh, that's that's so cool that you've been able to trace that all the way back. Oh.
Yes, it's amazing.
I just wondered, how much information there was on tracking that type of ancestry in terms of immigration from one country to another. I mean, immigration might not be the right word, but that's the word I'm going for, because it's not
Yeah,
migration.
absolutely. Yeah, but you can see how that, charitable sort of personality can go right back. And in some parts that it was there in Dad, but with his older brother, my uncle, who led the cult, it wasn't present at all. So there's some line going through that family where it's quite narcissistic, very selfish, and very sadistic as well. Thank goodness my dad was like he was, and I'm hoping that I'm like him.
When you mentioned that World War II had ended a few years before, so your father was ripe for the picking in terms of joining your uncle's new gathering. They call it like the time of peace immediately after war. But I imagine if you've been through certain experiences with war, if you've seen certain things, there's a chance that things that have just happened can be used to enforce what is on its way. Did your uncle weaponize the war in that way, do you think?
Didn't actually weaponize the war as such, but I think Dad fell victim to his influence, because my dad fought in New Guinea in the last 3 years of the war. And back then it was called the mopping up stage. There was still a lot of fighting going on. Dad was the scout that led his small platoon through the jungles of New Guinea, and that can be quite terrifying. So he was really cannon fodder. He saw a lot of the heavy fighting, and again that was very interesting because Dad always attributes that God saved his life during the heaviest time. During one phase of the mopping up stage, Dad came down with malaria, and he was pushed back into behind the lines and went to hospital there so he could recover. And a lot of his mates got killed. And Dad says, well, God had his hand on my life, and I survived the war, and I was able to come home. So that was an indicator for Dad, and he only realised that later. But I think I often wondered whether Dad carried a lot of guilt because, you're a young soldier, you're fighting and you're killing people, and whether he carried that guilt back home, and that made him more vulnerable to being recruited into the cult. I've often wondered that, because as a child, an innocent child, I used to say to Dad, because he used to sit down and talk about all these war stories, but they were always the happy events, the mateship and everything that would go on, funny stories. He'd never talk about the seriousness of war. And I used to say to Dad, did you kill any Japanese, Dad? I was so curious. A child would ask that question, and he would always react in a way, don't you ever ask me that? Don't you ever ask me that? So I think there was some trauma associated with what he went through in the war. But we as children never saw that. And he feels like God saved him, really.
Maybe in that sense, there's an underlying feeling of needing to repent for the rest of your life, give back for the rest of your life, and maybe that's one of the things that especially if they are the types of principles that your uncle was preaching, then maybe that was another reason why the group that your uncle formed felt like the right place for your father to be. But this is just me speculating. Of course, I could be way off the mark. But I just,
I think so. Well, with my uncle, he refused. He was called up, but he refused to go. And he became a conscientious objector. That's what they were called. And he He could have gone to jail, but he said that he prayed and that God saved him from that punishment, but he was given community service. So he didn't suffer the trauma of war like my father did and his two other brothers. And so he had a comfortable life. He lived his life through the war, doing a bit of charity work, which have made him feel good about himself, and he was preparing for this exclusive little group when Dad came home. So as you say, and as I say, Dad was ripe for the pickings, and that's exactly what happened.
And you're born in 1957, so the group's around 7 years old at the time that you're born. Do you have any idea of what has been accomplished in those 7 years in terms of group size or location?
It's a good question. So from my earliest memories, so I was born in 57. From my earliest memories, I never recall a large group. It was very small, and it was largely made up of 3 or 4 families only. We were the core and the centre of that group. However, people would come and go, and there was a period of time in the late 60s where my uncle came up with this bright idea that he would do a not a recruitment drive as such, but an outreach. And every Saturday night, he would hire these Christian movies from the Gospel Film Ministry, which was in Melbourne. And it attracted a lot of people on those Saturday nights. Then we hired a big hall. This is in country Victoria. And we would get people, the numbers would grow to over 100, which was large for the town that we lived in. But there was just this core group of people, which was my family, which was my uncle's family, and another family who the mother of that family, she was also, she became a Christian under the Oral Roberts ministry in Melbourne around the same time as my uncle, and she attached herself to us. So there was just the 3 families for as long as I can remember, to be honest.
Do you know if your uncle had plans or wishes to grow the group and just wasn't able to, or was it by intention that the group always stayed quite small?
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
He wanted to grow the group. That was his intention, to get recruits in no matter what. But he was very harsh, and we had a lot of rules, and some of the rules were just horrendous. If you can think of anything like the Exclusive Brethren, that's what we were like, or the Westboro Baptist Church, that's what we were like. So we weren't allowed to cut our hair, for example. We had to wear long hair, which he took from the Bible. Women need to have their hair long as a covering. We weren't allowed to wear jeans or slacks or anything like that, long dresses below the knee, what else can I say? We were very dowdy and old-fashioned, and you can imagine me going to high school when it was the early 70s, and if you can imagine what the dress length was like then, the dresses were as short as they could possibly go, and here I am with my long uniform down to my knee looking like a freak. You can imagine where this deep sense of embarrassment and shame, we weren't allowed to blend into society. So people could see that, and they didn't want to have a bar of it. And the other things that we couldn't do, we couldn't eat meat. We weren't allowed to eat meat because it was unclean. We're allowed to eat chicken and fish. We weren't allowed to drink tea or coffee. We weren't allowed to have relationships outside the cult. There are just so many rules and regulations. And on top of that, there was a lot of spying going on. Like, for example, my brother only reminded me of this the other day because I'd completely forgotten about it. He would send one of his children down to our house and listen in to what was being said and watch and observe about what we were doing so that he would use that as ammunition to preach from the pulpit to make us feel guilty and pull us into line. So it was very extreme.
That's tough, because these your cousins then we're talking about at this point, that if they are living in the house of the leader of the group, what choice do they have in going to your house and feeding information back? And do they recognize that there was a choice to be made in the first place? Because I don't know that you would know.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Even though there was these core members, which were made up of 3 families, there was a very strong hierarchy. My uncle was considered like almost a prophet, and he used to use the scripture in the Bible, touch not my anointed, do my prophets no harm. Me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And he went so far as to put a plaque on his front door called the House of Bethuel, and that's taken from the Old Testament. They were the special ones. He and his family were the special ones. And so we came next in line, but the special ones, the special family would look down on us. So I grew up feeling like I was unimportant. I didn't measure up. I was looked down upon even by my cousins. And there was this really codependent, really conflicted, toxic relationship between me and my cousins. I grew up with a cousin who were only 3 weeks apart in age. I was born in the November. She was born in the early December. And going through school, we were very close, but we weren't. So there was a lot of infighting that was going on in this small group. Now, the other family, I just wanted to highlight to you, this woman, she was married initially, but all the relationships were tampered with and interfered with to the extent that her marriage failed. Her husband couldn't take it any longer. And I think on top of that, she had an undiagnosed mental illness, which was paranoid schizophrenia, which was not diagnosed until towards the end of her life. So she was very extreme, and the cult fed her paranoia in many ways. It made it worse. She would go into these moments where she felt that she had to fast, and she would fast to the point where she would almost die. She'd go for weeks on end and come out, and her face was like thunder and really dark and sinister. She was very scary, and she was a harm to herself and other people at times. So
that's so tough, isn't it? Because it must have been a struggle for her as well, not understanding what reality was real, because people with certain types of schizophrenia can lose themselves in the reality that is not true to us. From my understanding of working on a ward with individuals with schizophrenia, and they're all aged over 70, so they're all like I don't even know what words you'd use. Like cantankerous, as well as struggling with ill mental health as well.
Well, she used to, because we were all forced to get out and try and get recruitments into the church too. And so what would happen in Ballarat country, Victoria, it used to get very cold and we'd get below zero there, and sometimes we'd get snow there. But we were made to stand on the corner, a particular corner in the main street of the town, and preach. And the preaching of this woman, who was part of the third family, she had this very shrill voice and she'd be preaching. She looked terrifying because she would wear skirts right down almost to her ankles. And she had this long black grey hair that hung down. And she would scream out, the fear of hell. And I remember the words she used to say exactly: hell with all its horror and terror will be your eternal abode if you don't give your life to Christ. People would walk past and mock her. And sometimes I was there. We as children were also forced to preach. Come rain, hail or shine. It was freezing cold sometimes. Even as a primary school age child, I was forced to do it. Sometimes our schoolmates would walk past and mock us. And so it was very traumatic. It was an incredibly hard thing to force young children to do that. And on top of all of that, at the age of 2, I developed a chronic illness called cyclic vomiting syndrome. And it was due, I believe, it was triggered. First off, I sustained 3rd-degree burns, and I was in hospital for, I think, up to 3 months. And all the trauma of that, and then this vomiting thing hit me at around age 2. And it was severe. It was really severe, to the point where I couldn't hold food or water down. And it would go on for sometimes weeks. I'd be vomiting every 5 minutes on end, all day, all night. I couldn't sleep. My stomach was just churning. Back then, there was no name for it. But all of the stress and all of the anxiety and the fear of hell and death was so heavily weighing on me that it affected me that way. And it went on for 20 years. I was in and out of hospital. I had a bed available to me when I was allowed to go to hospital, but sometimes the leader would say, we need to pray and she'll get better. And I remember when I was about 8 or 9, I was in grade 5. I had been vomiting solidly for 2 weeks and I felt myself slipping, and I was close to death. And Dad, who I loved dearly, who was very dogmatic at that stage because he was heavily influenced by his brother, he said, no, we'll pray, God will heal her. And Mum finally stepped in and she said, listen, she needs to go to hospital. And she bundled me into the car. We got up to the hospital. I slipped into a coma that night and was in that coma for 10 days. I nearly died because they withheld medical help for me. And that happened a number of times. So it was extreme. It was very extreme. And looking back, I think I pushed it to the back of my mind, for many, many years, and did not really want to face the reality of what I actually went through. And a lot of us ex-members always tried to play it down, but it was harsh. That's the bottom line.
Was there ever a point where social services or child protection services got involved with you being so neglected and malnutritioned? Was there not a point where social workers stepped in?
No. And that's the other thing with my mum. Dad came from a very, not a loving well, his mother was very loving. He had a very close bond with his mum. My mum came from a very abusive family background, and I suspect that she might have also been on the spectrum. So she was a very nervous, anxious woman. And I'll get into that a little bit more about what happened between her and the leader. But just simply to say that, you know, she was different she came from a large family. She was one of 7 sisters and 1 brother. And all of her other siblings were very extroverted. Mum was very withdrawn, anxious, afraid of the world, and couldn't build this bond with her own children. And I was born not long after my older brother. And, I think we're 15 months apart in age, and she didn't want me. And so that attachment was never there. So there was a lot of neglect coming from my mum, which not just was influenced by the church, but also by her personally. And so I think some of the teachers at school realised what was going on, but no one ever did anything. And I had no one to turn to, no one at all. So it was incredibly difficult.
That's absolutely astonishing to me that no person intervened in that situation when you can clearly see that a child is dying. I know that we're talking sort of 50 or so years ago, but even then, surely there must have been some type of protocol in place to protect children.
Not back then.
Wow.
The system was very slack. And, no one, back in those days, you didn't interfere in the private lives of families. Even with domestic and family violence, things have changed so much today. I got very triggered when I spent a placement in child safety back in 2001. And I saw, because I buried it so deep down and didn't really sort of face it really. But when I was doing my social work degree, I had to spend a couple of pracs out there in the field, and one of them was with child safety department. And I thought, oh my goodness, that was me. That was me. And no one was there to look after me. I had no one to turn to. So it was hard.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on chumbacasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at chumbacasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's chumbacasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.